The K-19, a Project 627A November-class submarine, was not merely a vessel, it was a statement. As she slid down the ways at the Severodvinsk shipyard number 402 in October 1959, she represented the zenith of Soviet technological and military ambition in the early Cold War. Her sleek, whale-like profile, over 114 meters long, concealed a revolutionary power plant, 2 VMA pressurized water reactors, enabling her to cruise beneath the polar ice at speeds and for durations that NATO analysts could scarcely believe. She was designed to be the ultimate deterrent, a first-strike weapon that could lurk undetected off the coast of the United States and unleash her payload of 3 nuclear-tipped R-13 ballistic missiles with world-ending finality. Her design specifications read like a fantasy of invulnerability. Her pressure hull was constructed of high-strength, low-alloy AK-25 steel, a special formulation developed to withstand the incredible pressures of deep dives, rated to a crush depth of over 300 meters. Internal compartmentalization, massive bulkheads, and redundant systems were engineered to ensure she could survive torpedo hits, near-miss depth charges, and even the shockwave of a distant nuclear blast. Propaganda films hailed her as the unsinkable sentinel of the motherland, a triumph of socialist engineering over capitalist limitation. Her crew, the brightest and most politically reliable officers and sailors of the Northern Fleet, were told they were invincible, protected by the finest steel and the most brilliant minds of the Soviet Union. But deep inside her armored hull, in the very bones of the Leviathan, a single, catastrophic detail was already working against her. The steel that formed her pressure hull, the steel upon which the lives of 139 men and the geopolitical balance of power depended, was not what the blueprints promised. The chemical composition was off, a critical imbalance of carbon, manganese, and nickel. The heat treatment during its rolling had been rushed, inconsistent. The crystalline structure of the alloy, which should have been uniform and resilient, was instead flawed with microscopic inclusions and stress points. It was subtly, invisibly brittle. No one in the high command knew. The certificates of quality from the steel mill, the stamps of approval from the naval inspectors were all in perfect order. The system had produced its paperwork, and the paperwork declared the steel perfect. To question it was to question the system. So perhaps some did suspect. A foreman who noticed an unusual spark pattern during cutting. A welder who found the metal behaving with a strange granularity under his torch. But in the shadow of the yard's directorate, under the portraits of stern-faced Politburo members, who would dare to ask? Who would dare to halt the launch of the flagship of Soviet naval prestige, to suggest that the foundation of their national might was fundamentally, fatally flawed? The question was left unvoiced, swallowed by the roar of the arc welders and the relentless pressure of production quotas. The poison was baked into her bones before she ever tasted the sea. The date was July 4, 1961. The K-19 was conducting her first major combat training exercise in the frigid waters of the Norwegian Sea, south of Greenland. Codenamed Polarny Express, the drill was meant to simulate a full strategic patrol, a final shakedown before she assumed her place on the front line of nuclear deterrence. The atmosphere aboard was tense, but professional. This was the culmination of years of training. Captain First Rank Nikolai Zateyev, a competent and respected commander, oversaw operations from the control room. The sea was calm, the boat running smoothly at a depth of 120 meters. Then, at 04:15 Moscow time, it began. It started not with a jolt, but with a sound. Deep in the bowels of the submarine, in the forward reactor compartment, a stoker petty officer named Boris Korchalov was making his rounds. He stopped, listening. Above the ever-present hum of the turbines and the whir of ventilation, he heard it, a low metallic groan, drawn out and resonant, like the deep sigh of a giant under immense strain. It seemed to come from the port-side primary cooling circuit pipes. He reported it to the reactor officer, who dismissed it as thermal expansion, the normal song of a complex machine under load. 15 minutes later, the groan came again, louder, followed by a sharper ping, like a hammer striking a bell. Then another, and another. The sounds were now telegraphing through the hull, a percussive, alarming chorus. In the control room, Captain First Rank Nikolai Zatayev felt a subtle vibration through the deck plates. A junior lieutenant monitoring the reactor panel frowned. The temperature in the port reactor's primary loop was creeping upward, a fraction of a degree every few seconds. It was within parameters, but the trend was wrong. At 0447, the metal screamed. It was a sound no sailor had ever heard, a horrific, high-pitched shriek of tearing metal, followed immediately by a deafening wet bang that shook the entire 4,000-ton vessel. Alarms erupted in a cacophony of klaxons and flashing red lights. The reactor temperature gauge for the port side spiked violently, its needles slamming against the stop. In the reactor compartment, a catastrophic failure had occurred. A welded joint in the primary cooling loop, a pipe carrying highly pressurized superheated water to keep the reactor core from melting, had violently ruptured. But this was no ordinary rupture. The flawed steel, subjected to constant pressure and vibration, had not simply split along a welding seam. It had shattered. The fracture was crystalline, brittle. A section of the thick piping blew out, ejecting a jet of radioactive steam and water at over 300 degrees Celsius into the compartment. Pressure dropped instantly in the primary loop. Without cooling water circulating, the uranium fuel rods in the port reactor began to heat up uncontrollably. They were on the brink of a meltdown, a China syndrome event that would not only destroy the submarine, but could contaminate a vast swath of the North Atlantic. The stress fractures, born from the faulty alloy, didn't stop at the pipe. The shock wave from the rupture traveled through the hull. In adjoining compartments, sailors reported seeing hair-thin cracks, like spider webs, skittering across the painted surfaces of bulkheads. The metal itself was betraying them. The steel that was supposed to protect them was fracturing under the stress of its own failure. The unsinkable ship was being killed from the inside out by the very material that formed her skeleton. The subsequent investigation, shrouded in absolute secrecy under the KGB's Department of Military Counterintelligence, was a forensic journey not just into a technical failure, but into the rotten heart of the late Stalinist industrial system. It led investigators away from the shipyard and into the vast smoke-belching complex of the Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, the flagship of Soviet metallurgy. The story they pieced together was one of systemic, state-mandated corruption. The AK-25 steel required for the Project 627 submarines was a specialty alloy. Its production was difficult, requiring precise control of chemistry, rolling temperatures, and quenching processes. The order from the Ministry of Shipbuilding was immense, and the deadlines were, as always, impossible, tied to the 7-year plan and the personal prestige of party officials. At Magnitogorsk, the factory director, a party loyalist named Viktor Malyshev, faced a dilemma. His furnace crews were behind schedule. A batch of the specialized nickel alloy required for the AK-25 formulation had failed to arrive on time. The quality control laboratory was insisting on remelting an earlier batch that showed inconsistent results in toughness tests. To halt production was to invite scrutiny, demotion, or worse. The system did not reward explanations, it rewarded tonnage produced, quotas met.
And so a quiet, unspoken sabotage was enacted. Malyshev gave the order, proceed. The missing nickel was compensated for by increasing the carbon content, a cheat that made the steel harder but catastrophically more brittle. The substandard batch was not remelted, its paperwork was corrected. The quenching process, which needed to be slow and controlled to relieve internal stresses, was accelerated to keep the production line moving. When the final bars were tested, the factory's own quality control chief, a man named Alexander Kolesnikov, was pressured to sign the certificates. He knew the Sharpie V-notch impact tests, which measure a metal's ability to absorb energy and resist shattering, were borderline. He knew the crystalline structure under the microscope was flawed, but Malyshev's word was law. The state demanded numbers, not safety. Kolesnikov stamped the steel Grade A, Spec AK-25. The lie was now encapsulated in official documentation. This steel, this physical manifestation of a lie, was then shipped to Severodvinsk. There, it was cut, bent, and welded into the pressure hull of the K-19. The welders, working with a material whose properties were a mystery even to them, found it difficult to work with. It was twitchy, prone to cracking if cooled too quickly, but their concerns, too, were lost in the momentum of the build. The system was a cascade of silent complicity, where each individual's fear of punishment for delay overrode the collective obligation to integrity. The investigators' final report was so devastating it was never fully circulated. It concluded that the disaster was not an accident, but a preordained structural catastrophe. The Soviet system, in its relentless drive for quantitative achievement, had created the conditions for its own qualitative failure. The ship had been built from quiet sabotage baked into its metal, a sabotage not of enemy agents, but of the state's own perverted incentives. The K-19's hull was not made of steel, it was made of fear, ambition, and lies. And on that day in the Barents Sea, it screamed its truth for all to hear. The initial failure was not an endpoint, it was a trigger. The brittle fracture in the cooling loop was a key pulled in a lock of unimaginable complexity. The system, designed with redundancy and resilience, now turned against itself with a furious, cascading logic. The rupture did not produce a clean, controllable leak. It was a guillotine cut through a major artery. Highly pressurized radioactive coolant, water that had been neutron activated by its passage through the reactor core, erupted into the compartment as a superheated geyser. The force of the blast was not merely hydraulic, it was explosive. It shredded adjacent piping like tinfoil, shearing through electrical conduits, instrument panels, and ventilation ducts. A dense white fog of vaporized coolant laced with radioactive isotopes like cobalt-60 and iodine-131 instantly filled the space, reducing visibility to zero and delivering a lethal dose of radiation to anyone not shielded. But the disaster was only beginning its domino run. The sudden catastrophic loss of pressure in the primary cooling loop caused an immediate runaway reaction in the port reactor. The control rods, designed to drop and shut down the fission process, were already in place, but they couldn't counteract the loss of the coolant medium itself. The temperature of the fuel rods spiked past 1,000 degrees Celsius. The zirconium cladding surrounding the uranium fuel pellets began to react with the steam now filling the core, producing hydrogen gas, highly volatile, and building up inside the crippled reactor vessel. The violence was not contained. The shock wave from the initial rupture traveled through the hull with seismic force. The flawed AK-25 steel, already under the immense strain of ocean pressure, resonated with the trauma. In the engine room aft, a senior mechanic named Ivan Petrov watched in horror as a hairline crack appeared in a major steam line support bracket. He had time to mutter, "That's not right," before the crack propagated with a sound like rending canvas. The bracket failed, and the heavy steam line, carrying 400-degree steam from the auxiliary boiler, whiplashed free. It smashed into a bank of electrical switchboards, sending a fountain of sparks cascading across the deck. Fires born from electrical shorts and ruptured fuel lines began to dance from deck to deck, feeding on paint, insulation, and stored supplies. Bulkheads, those sturdy walls of compartmentalization designed to contain flooding and fire, became instruments of entrapment. The force of internal explosions and the warping of the hull from uneven stress caused several watertight doors to jam in their tracks, sealing crews in doomed sections. In the forward torpedo room, sailors heard a deafening crunch from above, followed by the scream of tearing metal. The deck had above them visibly sagged. A structural beam, compromised by the spreading fractures, had buckled. Seawater, under hundreds of pounds of pressure, began to spray in through rivet holes, a fine, cold mist that promised a drowning death. Within minutes, the K-19 transformed from a sleek, predatory instrument of national power into a dying beast. The symphony of ordered machinery was replaced by a cacophony of destruction. The hiss of escaping steam, the crackle of fire, the groan of yielding metal, the frantic shouts of men. and underneath it all, the terrifying periodic bang of another component failing, a pump exploding, a pipe letting go, a support giving way. The most expensive Soviet naval project in a decade, a billion-ruble investment of national pride and technological aspiration, was now a sinking, burning, radioactive coffin. It was a systemic collapse, where every supposed safeguard became a link in a chain of doom, and the weakest link had been the very skin of the ship. Time, inside the mortally wounded submarine, became elastic and cruel. The 90 seconds that followed the primary rupture were not a uniform countdown to death, but a series of isolated personal apocalypses, each a study of courage, despair, and the basic human will to survive. In the radio room, a compartment now filling with smoke from an electrical fire in the ventilation shaft, Chief Petty Officer Anatoly Rogov fought to perform his duty. Sparks spat from his console. The main transmitter was dead, its circuits fried. He switched to the emergency set, a lower-powered battery-operated unit. His hands, slick with sweat and soot, tuned the frequency. He keyed the microphone, his voice a forced calm that crackled with static. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Soviet submarine K-19. Structural failure. We are losing the ship. Position approximately..." He gave the coordinates, his eyes darting to a gyroscope that was spinning uselessly. He repeated the message, a mantra of desperation into the void. Structural failure. We are losing the ship. He did not know if the signal was getting out, if anyone was listening in the vast, empty Arctic. He kept sending until smoke overwhelmed him, and he slumped over the key, his final transmission a long, dying carrier wave. Deep in the aft compartments, a group of stokers and mechanics, led by a tough senior sailor named Dmitry Volkov, fought a losing battle against the sea. A gasket on a seawater intake valve had blown, and a jet of icy Arctic water was roaring into the engine room. They struggled with wrenches on the valve wheel, but the pressure was too great. The water rose with terrifying speed, ankle deep, then knee deep, swirling with oil and debris. Volkov made a decision. "Forget it. To the life raft capsule," he roared, pointing to an escape trunk that led to a pressurized pod on the deck. They waited, then swam towards the hatch. Two made it inside before a sudden lurch of the ship, a result of uncontrolled flooding forward, slammed the heavy steel door shut on its hydraulic mechanism, trapping the others in the rising, frigid blackness.
In the control room, the heart of the vessel, Captain Zatayev stood amidst a tableau of chaos. The air was thick with smoke from burning insulation. Warning lights glowed red across every panel. The inclinometer showed the bow was already dipping 5 degrees down. His officers shouted conflicting reports. "Reactor core temperature exceeding limits. Fire in compartment 4. Forward batteries flooding." Zatayev's training screamed for him to give orders, to orchestrate a defense, but the systems were collapsing faster than commands could be issued. He saw the faces of his young sailors, eyes wide with a fear beyond combat, the fear of being trapped in a machine that was eating itself. Some looked to him for a miracle he could not provide. He gave the only order left that mattered. Abandon ship. All who can, make for the escape hatches. But even as he said it, he knew. The intercom was dead. The passageways were blocked. The order would never reach most of them. Some tried to reach the lifeboats, the few inflatable rafts stowed in canisters on the afterdeck. To get there meant navigating vertical ladders through smoke-filled trunks, fighting against the increasing angle of the deck, hoping the hatches weren't jammed or welded shut by heat. Few succeeded. Others stayed at their posts. In the reactor compartment itself, a junior engineer named Yuri Ponomaryev, knowing the core was on the verge of a meltdown that could poison the ocean, remained with a team of volunteers in a vain attempt to rig an emergency cooling line. They worked in a hellscape of steam and blinding radiation, their hands blistering on hot metal, buying seconds for their comrades with their own lives. They would not leave. 90 seconds after the first metallic scream, the outcome was irrevocable. The ship was not just damaged, it was undergoing a rapid structural dissolution.
The combination of internal explosions, raging fires, and massive, uncontrolled flooding had destroyed her buoyancy and her integrity. The bow plunged deeper. A final monstrous groan echoed through the hull as the pressure of the deep sea, meeting the compromised steel, found its victory. Water erupted into previously dry spaces. Lights finally died for good. The cold of the Arctic Ocean began its final, intimate embrace of the vessel. The K-19 was doomed. In those 90 seconds, the crew experienced the full spectrum of human extremity, from the disciplined repetition of a mayday call to the frantic scramble for survival, from the self-sacrifice of engineers in a radioactive fog to the paralyzed horror of those trapped by sealed hatches. It was not a single death, but hundreds of individual endings, all contained within the dying shell of a machine that had promised them invincibility and had delivered instead a tomb. The first signals received in Moscow were not of tragedy, but of treason. The fragmented, desperate mayday from the K-19 was intercepted by a monitoring station in Murmansk. Its contents so catastrophic, it was deemed implausible. The unsinkable flagship could not be sinking, therefore the message must be flawed, or worse, a provocation. When confirmation finally arrived via a garbled relay from a distressed fishing trawler that had seen the sub's final moments, the machinery of the state did not shift into mourning or investigation. It shifted into defense. The truth, a systemic industrial failure at the heart of Soviet prestige, was an ideological contaminant. It could not be allowed to spread. The official response was a multi-layered operation of blame shifting and obfuscation, a cover-up that would ultimately cost more in lives, resources, and moral authority than the disaster itself. The first sacrificial offerings were the survivors. The 23 men who had miraculously escaped the sinking, pulled from the freezing water by the trawler, were not greeted as heroes. They were isolated upon reaching Severomorsk. In a secure barracks, they were debriefed not by naval officers, but by men from the KGB's 3rd Directorate. The questioning was not aimed at understanding the technical failure. It was aimed at constructing a narrative. Were there lapses in procedure? Did the captain make errors? Was there any hint of dissent, of poor morale, of foreign influence? Under relentless pressure, exhausted and traumatized, some sailors gave fragmented statements about the strange sounds, the rapid spread of fire, the jammed hatches. These were not seen as symptoms of a material failure, but as evidence of human error. A preliminary report, stamped Soversheno Secreto, top secret, concluded that a chain of command failures and crew neglect during a complex reactor exercise led to a loss of control. Captain First Rank Nikolai Zateyev, a broken man who had watched his command and most of his men die, was not court-martialed. That would have been too public. Instead, he was subjected to a closed peer review by a panel of admirals who knew the real story, but were powerless against the political directive. He was found guilty of insufficient vigilance in technical supervision and failure to ensure crew readiness for emergency procedures. His career was obliterated. He was quietly transferred to a desk job in a logistics office in Vladivostok, a living ghost, a walking receptacle for blame that should have been laid at the feet of the men in Moscow and Magnitogorsk. When even this scapegoating proved insufficient to quell the whispers within the Admiralty, where engineers who understood reactors and home metals were asking dangerous questions, the story evolved. A new, more sinister theory was floated in classified corridors: enemy sabotage. Had NATO intelligence infiltrated the supply chain? Could a foreign agent have tampered with a critical valve during a port call? This theory, though never officially published, served a vital purpose. It redirected internal suspicion outward. It justified a massive, wasteful expansion of counterintelligence operations within the shipyards and the Northern Fleet, sowing paranoia
and stifling any genuine technical inquiry. It also provided a pretext for the most drastic step of all, the erasure of the evidence. The wreck of the K-19 lay in over 200 meters of water, a radioactive tomb. To leave it was to leave a potential intelligence bonanza for the Americans if they found it, but to raise it was to bring the proof of the faulty steel into the light. The decision was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. They would not raise the sub. They would bury it deeper. Over the next 2 years, the Soviet Navy conducted a series of highly classified deep-sea engineering tests in the area. Submarines and surface ships, using advanced for the time sonar and remote cameras, mapped the wreck. Then, in an operation codenamed Podum, the Ascent, a cruel irony, they used shaped underwater charges and heavy dredging equipment to collapse the remains under thousands of tons of rock and sediment. They created an artificial, unstable mound over the site, turning the grave into a geological hazard to deter any future investigation. The sea itself was made an accomplice to the cover-up. The paper trail was next. Design specifications for the AK-25 steel used in the Project 627 class were quietly altered. The flawed batch numbers from Magnitogorsk were purged from the record, replaced with fictitious numbers tied to earlier successful batches. The engineers at the shipyard who had voiced concerns during construction were reassigned. The director of the Magnitogorsk mill, Viktor Malyshev, was not punished for producing faulty steel. He was promoted for fulfilling production quotas under difficult circumstances and transferred to a ministerial post in Moscow. The system rewarded the crime and punished the truth seekers. The cost of this cover-up was astronomical and paid in a currency beyond rubles. It condemned future submarine crews to the same risks as the underlying steel problem was never addressed, only hidden. It fostered a culture of fear and silence where technical honesty was a career-ending liability. It wasted immense resources on phantom sabotage threats and geological concealment operations. And it sank, along with the ship, the reputations of brave men, the trust of the Navy in its own supply chain, and any last pretense that the system valued human life or truth over the brittle facade of its own infallibility. They hid the evidence, sinking reputations, shredding files, burying wreckage with the same ruthless efficiency and the same fatal flaw as the metal that had failed them.
The Soviet Union collapsed, not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic sigh. As the Iron Curtain rusted through, long-guarded secrets began to seep into the open air. In the early 1990s, a joint Russian-Norwegian scientific expedition, nominally studying Arctic seafloor ecology, received tacit permission from a cash-strapped and disorganized Russian Navy to survey the area of the K-19 disaster. They carried with them advanced remote-operated vehicles, or ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras and robotic arms. The wreck site was found not where the official falsified naval charts indicated, but under the massive, unnatural mound of debris. The ROVs, their lights piercing the perpetual midnight of the deep, descended upon a scene of silent, profound revelation. There was no evidence of a torpedo hit, no inward curling of hull plates from an external explosion. There was no sign of the enemy sabotage the KGB had whispered about, no neatly severed cables or suspicious devices. What the cameras revealed was a corpse in a state of violent internal disintegration. The pressure hull had not been crushed by depth, it had unzipped. Long, jagged fissures ran along weld lines, but these were not clean splits. The metal edges were crystalline, gnawed-looking, with a texture like shattered glass. In sections where the ROV's manipulator arm gently brushed away marine growth, the steel itself showed a granular, almost crumbly fracture pattern, the hallmark of brittle failure. One of the scientists, a Norwegian metallurgist watching the feed on the mothership's monitor, whispered to his colleague, That is not ductile tearing. That is cleavage fracture. The metal lost all its toughness. It just gave up. The most telling detail was found near the rupture point of the primary cooling loop. A section of pipe, thicker than a man's thigh, was visible. It had not burst like an overinflated balloon. It had shattered like a porcelain vase. The fracture surface, when magnified by the ROV's camera, showed a distinct beach-like pattern of ridges, known in failure analysis as chevron markings or herringbone patterns. These markings point directly back to the origin of the fracture. In this case, they pointed unerringly to a single weld. But more critically, the nature of the pattern confirmed the material had failed with minimal plastic deformation. It had snapped, not stretched. The robotic probe took minute samples of the hull metal. Later analysis in a laboratory would confirm what the images suggested: low nickel content, high carbon, inconsistent microstructure. It was exactly the substandard, quota-fulfilling cocktail the buried KGB report had described decades earlier. The story the wreck told was mute, but eloquent. It was not a story of war or espionage or even dramatic human error. It was a story of metal. Metal that had been asked to do a heroic job. Metal that had been forged in a furnace of political pressure and institutional fear. Metal that had been stamped perfect by men who knew it was not. And metal that, when pushed to its duty, had simply shattered under its own weight, both physical and metaphorical. The divers and scientists who witnessed this saw the ultimate cold truth. The most expensive disaster in Soviet naval history, a loss measured in billions of rubles, 116 lives, and incalculable strategic confidence, was caused by a failure so simple, so fundamentally rooted in the neglect of basic materials science that it was heartbreaking. It was preventable. A better batch of steel, a more honest quality controller, a system that valued integrity over quotas, any one of these could have averted the catastrophe. But in the Soviet Empire of the early 1960s, none of those things were as important as the plan, the prestige, the facade. The K-19 lay on the ocean floor not as a monument to enemy action, but as a cenotaph for truth, a silent, rusting indictment of a system that built its dreams on foundations of lies and watched, in horror, as they cracked wide open.